representative from the governor's office seemed skeptical and unconvinced, but open-minded. The Attorney General's group was neutral so far. Dr. Walsh had already heard enough from me and Campbell. "That's a definite possibility," I said. "It's one of the reasons I'd like to try the regressive hypnosis. For one thing, we can see if his stories remain consistent." "If he's susceptible to hypnosis," Walsh interjected. "And if you can tell whether or not he'd been hypnotized." "I suspect that he is susceptible," I answered quickly. "And I have my doubts that he is. Frankly, I have my doubts about you, Cross. I don't care that he likes to talk to you. Psychiatry isn't about liking your doctor. What he likes is that I listen." I glared across the table at Walsh. It took a lot of self-control not to jump on the officious bastard. "What are the other reasons for hypnotizing the prisoner?" the governor's representative spoke up. "Frankly, we don't know enough about what he's done during these fugue states," Dr. Campbell said. "Neither does he. Neither do his wife and family, whom I've interviewed several times now." I added, "We're also not sure how many personalities might be operating." "The other reason for hypnosis," I paused to let what I was about to say sink in, "is that I do want to ask him about Maggie Rose Dunn. I want to try and find out what he did with Maggie Rose." "Well, we've heard your arguments, Dr. Cross. Thank you for your time and efforts here," James Dowd said at the end of the presentation. "We'll have to let you know." I decided to take things into my own hands that evening. I called a reporter I knew and trusted at the Post. I asked him to meet me at Pappy's Diner on the edge of Southeast. Pappy's was one place where we would never be spotted, and I didn't want anyone to know we'd met, for both our sakes. Lee Covell was a graying yuppie, and kind of an asshole, but I liked him. Lee wore his emotions on his sleeve. His petty jealousies, his bitterness about the sad state of journalism, his bleeding heart tendencies, his occasional arch-conservative traits. It was all out there for the world to see and react to. Lee plopped down next to me at the counter. He was wearing a gray suit and light blue running shoes. Pappy's draws a real nice cross-section. Black, Hispanic, Korean, working-class whites who service Southeast in some way or other. But no one anything like Lee. "I stick out like a sore thumb in here," he complained. "I'm way too cool for this place." "Now who's going to see you here? Bob Woodward? Evans and Novak?" "Very funny, Alex. What's on your mind? Why didn't you call me when this story was hot, before this sucker got caught?" "Would you give this man some hot, very black coffee?" I said to the counterman. "I need to wake him up." I turned back to Lee. "I'm going to hypnotize Saniji inside the prison. I'm going looking for Maggie Rose Dunn in his subconscious. You can have the exclusive, but you owe me one," I told Lee. Lee Covell almost spit out his reaction. "Bullshit. Let's hear it all, Alex. I think you left out some parts." "Right. I'm working to get permission to hypnotize Saniji. There are a lot of petty politics involved. If you leak the story in the Post, I think it will happen. The theory of self-fulfilling prophecies. I'll get permission, then you get an exclusive." The coffee came in a beautiful old diner cup, light brown with a thin blue line under the rim. Lee slurped the Java, thoughtful as hell. He seemed amused that I was trying to manipulate the established order in D.C. It appealed to his bleeding heart. "And if you do hear something from Gary Saniji, I'll be the second to know. After yourself, Alex." "You drive a hard bargain, but yeah, that'll be our deal. Think about it, Lee. It's for a worthy cause. Finding out about Maggie Rose, not to mention your career." I left Covell to finish his Pappy's coffee and begin to shape his story. Apparently, that's what he did. It appeared in the morning edition of the Post. Nana Mama is the first one up at our house every day. Probably, she's the first one up in the entire universe. That's what Samson and I used to believe when we were 10 or 11, and she was the assistant principal of the Garfield North Junior High School. Whether I wake up at 7 or 6 or 5, I always come down to the kitchen to find a light blazing and Nana already eating breakfast or firing it up over her stove. Most mornings, it is the very same breakfast. A single poached egg, 1 corn muffin, buttered, weak tea with cream and double sugar. She will also have begun to make breakfast for the rest of us, and she recognizes the variety of our palates. The house menu might include pancakes and either pork sausage or bacon, melon in season, grits or oatmeal, or farina with a thick pat of butter and a generous mound of sugar on top, eggs in every shape and form. Occasionally, a grape jelly omelet appears, the only dish of hers that I don't care for. Nana does the omelet too brown on the outside, and, as I've told her, eggs and jelly make about as much sense to me as pancakes and ketchup. Nana disagrees, though she never eats the jelly omelets herself. The kids love them. Nana sat at the kitchen table on that morning in March. She was reading the Washington Post, which happens to be delivered by a man named Washington. Mr. Washington eats breakfast with Nana every Monday morning. This was a Wednesday, and an important day for the investigation. Everything about the breakfast scene was so familiar, and yet I was startled as I entered the kitchen. One more time, I was made aware of how much the kidnapping had entered into our private lives, the lives of my family members. The headline of the Washington Post read, "Saniji Murphy to be hypnotized." Attached to the story, I could see photographs of both Saniji Murphy and me. I'd heard the news late the night before. I had called Lee Covell to give him his exclusive because of our deal. I read Lee's story while eating 2 morning prunes. It said that certain unnamed sources were skeptical about the opinions of psychologists assigned to the kidnapper, that medical findings may have an effect on the trial, that if proven insane, Saniji Murphy could get a sentence as lenient as 3 years in an institution. Obviously, Lee had spoken to other sources after he talked to me. "Why don't they just come out and say what they mean?" Nana mumbled over her toast and cup of tea. I guess she didn't care for Lee's writing style. "Why don't they say what?" I asked. "The obvious thing here. Somebody doesn't want you messing around with his neat little case. They want tied, clean justice, not necessarily the truth. Nobody seems to want the truth here, anyway. They just want to feel better right away. They want the pain to be over. People have a low tolerance for pain, especially lately. Ever since Dr. Spock began rearing our children for us." "Is that what you've been plotting down here over your breakfast? Sounds a little like Murder, She Wrote." I poured myself some of her tea. No sugar or cream. I took a muffin and put a couple of link sausages between the halves. "No plots. Reality as plain as the nose on your face, Alex." I nodded at Nana. She might be right, but it was too deflating to deal with before 6 in the morning. "Nothing like prunes this early in the morning," I said. Good." Nana Mama frowned. "I might go easy on those prunes for a while if I were you. I suspect you're going to need an extra supply of bull from here on, Alex, if I may be so blunt with you." "Thank you, Nana. Your directness is appreciated." "You're very welcome. For your breakfast and this splendid advice. Don't trust white people." "Very good breakfast," I said to her. "How is your new girlfriend?" asked my grandmother. She never misses a trick. Chapter 50. There was a high-pitched humming in the air as I climbed out of my car at the prison. The noise was a physical thing. Reporters from newspapers and TV stations were loitering everywhere outside Lorton. They were waiting for me. So was Saniji Murphy. He had been moved to a regular cell in the prison. As I walked from the parking lot in a light drizzle, TV cameras and microphones jabbed at me from a dozen different angles. I was there to hypnotize Gary Saniji Murphy, and the press knew it. I was today's big bite of news. Thomas Dunn says you're trying to get Saniji hospitalized, that you'll have him set free in a couple of years. Any comment, Detective Cross? I have nothing to say right now. I couldn't talk to any of the reporters, which didn't make me real popular. I'd made a deal with the Attorney General's office before they finally agreed to the sessions. Hypnosis is commonly used in psychiatry these days. It's often administered by the treating psychiatrist or a psychologist. What I had hoped to discover over several interviews was what had happened to Gary Saniji Murphy during his lost days, his escapes from the real world. I didn't know whether this would happen quickly or, indeed, happen at all. Once I was inside Gary's prison cell, the process was simple and straightforward. I suggested that he relax and close his eyes. Next, I asked Gary to breathe in, then out, very evenly and slowly. I told him to try to clear his mind of every thought. Finally, to count down slowly from 100. He appeared to be a good subject for hypnosis. He didn't resist, and he slipped deeply into a suggestible state. As far as I could tell, he was under. I proceeded as if he were, anyway. I watched him for signs to the contrary, but I saw none. His breathing had slowed noticeably. In the beginning of the session, he was more relaxed than I had seen him before. We chatted about casual, non-threatening subjects for the first few moments. Since he had actually come to, or become himself, in the parking lot of McDonald's, I asked Gary about that once he was fully relaxed. Do you remember being arrested at a McDonald's in Wilkinsburg? There was a brief pause. Then he said, Oh, yes. Of course I do. I'm glad you remember, because I have a couple of questions about the circumstances at McDonald's. I'm a little unclear about the sequence of events. Do you remember anything you might have eaten inside the restaurant? I could see his eyes rolling behind the closed lids. He was thinking about it before answering. Gary had on thongs, and his left foot was tapping rapidly. No, can't say that I do. Did I actually eat there? I don't remember. I'm not sure if I ate or not. At least he didn't deny he'd been inside the McDonald's. Did you notice any people at the McDonald's? I asked. Do you remember any customers? A counter girl you might have spoken to? It was crowded. No one in particular comes to mind. I recall thinking that some people dress so badly it's comical. You see it in any mall, all the times at places like Hojo's and McDonald's. In his mind, he was still inside the McDonald's. He'd come that far with me. Stay with me, Gary. Did you use the restroom? I already knew that he had gone to the bathroom. Most of his actions were covered in the reports of the arrest. Yes, I used the restroom, he answered. How about a beverage? Something to drink? Bring me along with you. Put yourself right there as much as you can. He smiled. Please, don't condescend. He had cocked his head a little oddly. Then Gary started to laugh. A peculiar laugh, deeper than usual. Strange, though not completely alarming. His voice patterns were becoming more rapid and very clipped. His foot was tapping faster and faster. You're not smart enough to do this, he said. I was a little surprised by the change in his tone of voice. To do what? Tell me what you're saying, Gary. I don't follow you. To try and trick him. That's what I'm saying. You're bright, but not that bright. Who am I trying to trick? Saniji, of course. He's right there in the McDonald's. He's pretending to get coffee, but he's really pissed off. He's about to go nuclear. He needs attention now. I sat forward in my chair. I hadn't expected this. Why is he angry? Do you know why? I asked. He's pissed because they got lucky, that's why. Who got lucky? The police!